The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 9, Side 2. Soap was a rare luxury, but lice and vermin were easily secured. The simpler Chinese learned to itch and scratch with Confucian equanimity. Medical science made no ascertainable progress from Shi Huang Ti to the Dowager. Perhaps the same might be said of European medicine between Hippocrates and Pasteur. European medicine invaded China as an annex to Christianity, but the sick natives until our own time confined their use of it to surgery, and for the rest preferred their own physicians and their ancient herbs. 4. Religion without a church. Superstition and skepticism, animism, the worship of heaven, ancestor worship, Confucianism, Taoism, the elixir of immortality, Buddhism, religious toleration and eclecticism, Mohammedanism, Christianity, causes of its failure in China. Chinese society was built not on science but on a strange and unique mixture of religion, morals, and philosophy. History has known no people more superstitious and none more skeptical, no people more devoted to piety and none more rationalistic and secular, no nation so free from clerical domination, but none but the Hindus so blessed and cursed with gods. How shall we explain these contradictions, except by ascribing to the philosophers of China a degree of influence unparalleled in history, and at the same time recognizing in the poverty of China an inexhaustible fountain of hopeful fantasy? The religion of the primitive inhabitants was not unlike the faith of natural peoples generally, an animistic fear and worship of spirits lurking anywhere, a poetic reverence for the impressive forms and reproductive powers of the earth, and an awed adoration of a heaven whose energizing sunlight and fertilizing rains were part of the mystic rapport between terrestrial life and the secret forces of the sky. Wind and thunder, trees and mountains, dragons and snakes were worshipped, but the greater festivals celebrated above all the miracle of growth, and in the spring girls and young men danced and mated in the fields to give example of fertility to Mother Earth. Kings and priests were in those days near allied, and the early monarchs of China, in the edifying accounts which tendentious historians give of them in later years, were statesmen saints whose heroic deeds were always prefaced with prayers and aided by the gods. In this primitive theology, heaven and earth were bound together as two halves of a great cosmic unity, and were related very much as man and woman, lord and vassal, yang and yin. The order of the heavens and the moral behavior of mankind were kindred processes, parts of a universal and necessary rhythm called Tao, the heavenly way. Morality, like the law of the stars, was the cooperation of the part with the whole. The supreme God was this mighty heaven itself, this moral order, this divine orderliness that engulfed both men and things, dictating the right relationship of children to parents, of wives to husbands, of vassals to lords, of lords to the emperor, and of the emperor to God. It was a confused but noble conception, hovering between personality when the people prayed to Tien, heaven as a deity, and impersonality when the philosophers spoke of Tien as the just and beneficent, but hardly human or personal, sum of all those forces that ruled the sky, the earth, and men. Gradually, as philosophy developed, the personal conception of heaven was confined to the masses of the people, and the impersonal conception was accepted by the educated classes and in the official religion of the state. Out of these beginnings grew the two elements of the orthodox religion of China, the nationwide worship of ancestors and the Confucian worship of heaven and great men. Every day some modest offering, usually of food, was made to the departed, and prayers were sent up to their spirits. For the simple peasant or laborer believed that his parents and other forebears still lived in some ill-defined realm, and could bring him good or evil fortune. The educated Chinese offered similar sacrifice, but he looked upon the ritual not as worship so much as commemoration. It was wholesome for the soul and the race that these dead ones should be remembered and revered, for then the ancient ways which they had followed would also be revered, innovation would hesitate, and the empire would be at peace. There were some inconveniences in this religion, for it littered China with immense inviolable graves, impeding the construction of railroads and the tillage of the soil. But to the Chinese philosopher these were trivial difficulties when weighed in the balance against the political stability and spiritual continuity which ancestor worship gave to civilization. For through this profound institution the nation, which was shut out from physical and spatial unity by great distances and the poverty of transport, achieved a powerful spiritual unity in time. The generations were bound together with the tough web of tradition, and the individual life received an ennobling share and significance in a drama of timeless majesty and scope. The religion adopted by the scholars and the state was at once a widening and a narrowing of this popular faith. Slowly, by increments of reverence from century to century, Confucius was lifted up, through imperial decrees, to a place second only to that of heaven itself. Every school raised a tablet, every city a temple in his honor, and periodically the emperor and the officials offered incense and sacrifice to his spirit or his memory, as the greatest influence for good in all the rich memories of the race. He was not, in the understanding of the intelligent, a god. On the contrary, he served for many Chinese as a substitute for a god. Those who attended the services in his honor might be agnostics or atheists, and yet, if they honored him and their ancestors, they were accepted by their communities as pious and religious souls. Officially, however, the faith of the Confucians included a recognition of Shang-Ti, the supreme ruling force of the world, and every year the emperor offered ceremonious sacrifice on the altar of heaven to this impersonal divinity. Nothing was said in this official faith of immortality. Heaven was not a place, but the will of God, or the order of the world. This simple and almost rationalistic religion never quite satisfied the people of China. Its doctrines gave too little room to the imagination of men, too little answer to their hopes and dreams, too little encouragement to the superstitions that enlivened their daily life. For the people, here as everywhere, brightened the prose of reality with the poverty of the supernatural. They felt a world of good or evil spirits hovering in the air about them and the earth beneath, and longed to appease the enmity or enlist the aid of these secret powers by magic incantation or prayer. They paid diviners to read the future for them in the lines of the I Ching, or on the shells of tortoises, or in the movements of the stars. They hired magicians to orient their dwellings and graves to wind and water, and sorcerers to bring them sunshine or rain. They exposed to death such children as were born to them on unlucky days, and fervent daughters sometimes killed themselves to bring good or evil fortune to their parents. In the South, particularly, the Chinese soul inclined to mysticism. It was repelled by the frigid rationalism of the Confucian faith, and hungered for a creed that would give China, like other nations, deathless consolations. Therefore, some popular theologians took the misty doctrine of Lao Tse and gradually transformed it into a religion. To the old master and to Chuang Tse, the Tao had been a way of life for the attainment of individual peace on earth. They did not seem ever to have dreamed of it as a deity, much less as a price to be paid here for a life beyond the grave. But in the 2nd century of our era, these doctrines were improved upon by men who claimed to have received, in direct line from Lao Tse, an elixir that would confer immortality. This drink became so popular that several emperors are said to have died from pious indulgence in it. A mystagogue in Sichuan, circa 148 A.D., offered to cure all diseases with a simple talisman to be given in exchange for 5 packages of rice. Apparently miraculous cures were effected, and those who were not cured were told that their faith had been too weak. The people flocked to the new religion, built temples for it, supported its priesthood generously, and poured into the new faith some part of their inexhaustible superstitious lore. Lao Tse was made a god and was credited with a supernatural conception. He had been born, the faithful believed, already old and wise, having been in his mother's womb for 80 years. They peopled the world with new devils and deities, frightened away the one with firecrackers exploding merrily in the temple courts, and with mighty gongs called the others out of slumber to hear their importunate prayers. For 1,000 years the Taoist faith had millions of adherents, converted many emperors, and fought long battles of intrigue to wrest from the Confucians the divine right to tax and spend. In the end it was broken down not by the logic of Confucius, but by the coming of a new religion even better suited than itself to inspire and console the common man. For the Buddhism that began its migration from India to China in the 1st century after Christ was not the hard and gloomy doctrine that the Enlightened One had preached 500 years before. It was no ascetic creed, but a bright and happy faith in helping deities and a flowering paradise. It took the form, as time went on, of the greater vehicle, or Mahayana, which Kanishka's theologians had adapted to the emotional needs of simple men. It presented China with freshly personal and humane gods, like Amitabha, ruler of paradise, and Kuan Yin, god then goddess of mercy. It filled the Chinese pantheon with Lohans or Arhats, 18 of the original disciples of Buddha, who stood ready at every turn to give of their merits to help a bewildered and suffering mankind. When, after the fall of the Han, China found itself torn with political chaos, and life seemed lost in a welter of insecurity and war, the harassed nation turned to Buddhism as the Roman world was at the same time turning to Christianity. Taoism opened its arms to take in the new faith, and in time became inextricably mingled with it in the Chinese soul. Emperors persecuted Buddhism, philosophers complained of its superstitions, statesmen were concerned over the fact that some of the best blood of China was being sterilized in monasteries. But in the end, the government found again that religion is stronger than the state. The emperors made treaties of peace with the new gods. The Buddhist priests were allowed to collect alms and raise temples, and the bureaucracy of officials and scholars was perforce content to keep Confucianism as its own aristocratic creed. The new religion took possession of many old shrines, placed its monks and fanes along with those of the Taoists on the holy mountain Tai Shan, aroused the people to many pious pilgrimages, contributed powerfully to painting, sculpture, architecture, literature, and the development of printing, and brought a civilizing measure of gentleness into the Chinese soul. Then it, too, like Taoism, fell into decay. Its clergy became corrupt, its doctrine was permeated more and more by sinister deities and popular superstitions, and its political power, never strong, was practically destroyed by the renaissance of Confucianism under Chu. Today its temples are neglected, its resources are exhausted, and its only devotees are its impoverished priests. Nevertheless, it has sunk into the national soul, and is still part of the complex but informal religion of the simpler Chinese. For religions in China are not mutually exclusive as in Europe and America, nor have they ever precipitated the country into religious wars. Normally they tolerate one another not only in the state but in the same breast, and the average Chinese is at once an animist, a Taoist, a Buddhist, and a Confucianist. He is a modest philosopher and knows that nothing is certain. Perhaps, after all, the theologian may be right, and there may be a paradise. The best policy would be to humor all these creeds and pay many diverse priests to say prayers over one's grave. While fortune smiles, however, the Chinese citizen does not pay much attention to the gods. He honors his ancestors, but lets the Taoist and the Buddhist temples get along with the attentions of the clergy and a few women. He is the most secular spirit ever produced as a type in known history. This life absorbs him, and when he prays he asks not for happiness in paradise, but for some profit here on earth. If the god does not answer his prayers, he may overwhelm him with abuse and end by throwing him into the river. No image-maker worships the gods, says a Chinese proverb. He knows what stuff they are made of. Hence the average Chinese has not taken passionately to Mohammedanism or Christianity. These offered him a heaven that Buddhism had already promised, but what he really wanted was a guarantee of happiness here. Most of the 15 million Chinese Muslims are not really Chinese, but people of foreign origin or parentage. Christianity entered China with the Nestorians about 636 A.D. The Emperor Tai Tsung gave it a sympathetic hearing and protected its preachers from persecution. In 781, the Nestorians of China raised a monument on which they recorded their appreciation of this enlightened tolerance and their hope that Christianity would soon win the whole land. Since then, Jesuit missionaries with heroic zeal and lofty learning, and Protestant missionaries backed with great American fortunes, have labored to realize the hope of the Nestorians. Today there are 3 million Christians in China. 1% of the population has been converted in 1,000 years. Christianity lost its opportunity early in the 18th century when a quarrel arose between the Jesuits and other Roman Catholic orders in China. The Jesuits had, with characteristic statesmanship, found formulas by which the essential elements of Chinese piety, ancestor worship and the adoration of heaven, could be brought under Christian forms without disrupting deep-rooted institutions or endangering the moral stability of China. But the Dominicans and Franciscans demanded a stricter interpretation and denounced all Chinese theology and ritual as inventions of the devil. The enlightened Emperor Kangxi was highly sympathetic to Christianity. He entrusted his children to Jesuit tutors and offered on certain conditions to become a Christian. When the Church officially adopted the rigid attitude of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, Kangxi withdrew his support of Christianity, and his successors decided to oppose it actively. In later days, the greedy imperialism of the West weakened the persuasiveness of Christian preaching and precipitated the passionate anti-Christianism of the revolutionary Chinese. 5. The rule of morals. The high place of morals in Chinese society, the family, children, chastity, prostitution, premarital relations, marriage and love, monogamy and polygamy, concubinage, divorce, a Chinese empress, the patriarchal male, the subjection of woman, the Chinese character. Confucianism and ancestor worship survived so many rivals and so many attacks during 20 centuries because they were felt to be indispensable to that intense and exalted moral tradition upon which China had founded its life. As these were the religious sanctions, so the family was the great vehicle of this ethical heritage. From parents to children, the moral code was handed down across the generations and became the invisible government of Chinese society, a code so stable and strong that that society maintained its order and discipline through nearly all the vicissitudes of the unsteady state. What the Chinese, said Voltaire, best know, cultivate the most, and have brought to the greatest perfection is morality. By building the house on a sound foundation, Confucius had said, the world is made secure. The Chinese proceeded on the assumption that the purpose of a moral code was to transform the chaos of sexual relations into an orderly institution for the rearing of children. The family's reason for being lay in the child. There could not, from the viewpoint of China, be too many children. A nation was always subject to attack and needed defenders. The soil was rich and could support many millions. Even if there should be a bitter struggle for existence in large families and crowded communities, the weakest would be eliminated, and the ablest would survive and multiply to be a support and an honor to their aging parents, and to tend the ancestral graves religiously. Ancestor worship forged an endless chain of reproduction, and gave it a double strength. The husband must beget sons not only to sacrifice to him after his death, but to continue the sacrifices to his ancestors. There are 3 things which are unfilial, said Mencius, and the greatest of them is to have no posterity. Sons were prayed for, and mothers were shamed forever if they had none, for sons could work better than girls in the fields, and could fight better in war, and a regulation not unconscious of this had long since decreed that only sons should be permitted to offer the ancestral sacrifice. Girls were a burden, for one had to rear them patiently only to see them go off at maturity to their husbands' homes, to labor there and beget laborers for another family. If too many daughters came and times were very hard, the infant girl might be, without sin, left exposed in the furrows to be killed by the night's frost or eaten by prowling swine. Such progeny as survived the hazards and ailments of childhood were brought up with the tenderest affection. Example took the place of blows in their education, and occasionally they were exchanged for a while for the children of kindred families, so that they might not be spoiled by an indulgent love. The children were kept in the women's division of the home, and seldom mingled with the adult males until the age of 7. Then the boys, if the family could afford it, were sent to school, and were severely separated from the girls. From the age of 10 they would be limited in their choice of associates to men and courtesans, and the frequency of homosexuality and male prostitution sometimes made this choice unreal. Chastity was exalted and rigidly enforced in daughters, and was inculcated with such success that Chinese girls have been known to kill themselves because they believed that they had been dishonored by the accidental touch of a man. But no effort was made to maintain chastity in the unmarried man. On the contrary, it was considered normal and legitimate that he should visit brothels. Sex, in the male, was an appetite like hunger, and might be indulged in without any other disgrace than that which would in any case attach to immoderation. Men sometimes prepared themselves openly for a night in a brothel by pictures, aphrodisiacs, and songs. It should be added that this lenience towards marital deviations is disappearing today. The supply of women to meet these demands had long since been an established institution in China. The famous premier of Qi, Guanchung, had provided a lupanar where traders from other states might leave their gains before departing for their homes. Marco Polo described the courtesans of Kublai Khan's capital as incredibly numerous and ravishingly beautiful. They were licensed, regulated, and segregated, and the most beautiful of them were supplied without charge to the members of foreign embassies. In later times, a special variety of charmers was developed, known as sing-song girls, who, if that were preferred, would provide educated conversation for young men or for respectable husbands entertaining guests. Such girls were often versed in literature and philosophy, as well as skilled in music and the dance. Premarital relations were so free from men, and premarital association with men was so restricted for respectable women, that small opportunity was given for the growth of romantic love. A literature of such tender affection appeared under the Tongs, and some indication of the sentiment may be found as far back as the 6th century before Christ in the legend of Wei Sheng, who, having promised to meet a girl under a bridge, waited vainly for her there, though the water rose above his head and drowned him. Doubtless Wei Sheng knew better than this, but it is significant that the poets thought that he might not. In general, however, love as a tender solicitude and attachment was more frequent between men than between the sexes. In this matter the Chinese agreed with the Greeks. Marriage had little to do with love. Since its purpose was to bring healthy mates together for the rearing of abundant families, it could not, the Chinese thought, be left to the arbitrament of passion. Hence the sexes were kept apart while the parents sought eligible mates for their children. It was considered immoral for a man not to marry. Celibacy was a crime against one's ancestors, the state, and the race, and was never quite condoned even in the case of the clergy. In the ancient days, a special official was appointed to see to it that every man was married by the age of 30, and every woman by 20. With or without the help of professional intermediaries, mei ren, go-betweens, parents arranged the betrothal of their children soon after puberty, sometimes before puberty, sometimes before birth. Certain endogamic and exogamic limits were placed on the choice. The mate had to be of a family long known to the match-seeking parents, and yet sufficiently distant in relationship to be outside the clan. The father of the boy usually sent a substantial present to the father of the girl, but the girl in her turn was expected to bring a considerable dowry, chiefly in the form of goods, to her husband, and gifts of some value were ordinarily exchanged between the families at the marriage. The girl was kept in strict seclusion until the wedding. Her future mate could not see her except by stratagem, though that was often managed. In many cases he saw her for the first time when he removed her veil in the wedding ceremony. This was a complex and symbolic ritual in which the essential matter was that the bridegroom should be sufficiently wined to guard against the chance of a criminal bashfulness on his part. As for the girl, she had been trained to be at once shy and obedient. After the marriage, the bride lived with her husband in or near the house of his father. There she labored in servitude to her mate and his mother, until such time as the normal course of life and death liberated her from this slavery and left her ready to impose it upon the wives of her sons. The poor were monogamous, but so eager was China for vigorous children that such men as could afford it were permitted by custom to take concubines or secondary wives. Polygamy was looked upon as eugenic, on the ground that those who could bear its expense would on the average be the abler men in their communities. If the first wife remained childless, she would in most cases urge her husband to take an additional mate, and would often adopt as her own the child of the concubine. There were many instances in which wives, anxious to keep their husbands home, suggested that they should marry the courtesans to whom they were giving their attention and their substance, and should bring them home as secondary wives. The wife of the Emperor Chuang-Chu was much praised in Chinese tradition, because she was reported to have said, "I have never ceased to send people to all the neighboring towns to look for beautiful women, in order that I might represent them as concubines to my lord." Families rivaled one another in seeking the honor of providing a daughter for the royal harem. To guard the harem and to attend to other duties at his court, the emperor was entitled to 3,000 eunuchs. Most of these had been mutilated by their parents before the age of 8 in order to ensure their livelihood. In this paradise of the male, the secondary wives were practically slaves, and the chief wife was merely the head of a reproductive establishment. Her prestige depended almost entirely on the number and sex of her children. Educated to accept her husband as a lord, she might win some modest happiness by falling quietly into the routine expected of her. And so adaptive is the human soul that the wife and husband, in these prearranged unions, seem to have lived in a peace no more violent than that which follows the happy endings of Western romantic love. The woman could be divorced for almost any cause, from barrenness to loquacity. She herself could never divorce her husband, but she might leave him and return to her parents, though this was a matter of rare resort. Divorce in any case was infrequent, partly because the lot of the divorced woman was too unpleasant to be thought of, partly because the Chinese were natural philosophers and took suffering as the order of the day. Very probably in pre-Confucian times the family had centered around the mother as the source of its existence and its authority. In the earliest period, as we have seen, the people knew their mothers but not their fathers, and the character for a man's family name is still formed from the radical for woman. The word for wife meant equal, and the wife preserved her own name after marriage. As late as the 3rd century of our era, women held high administrative and executive positions in China, even to ruling the state. The Dowager Empress merely followed in the steps of that Empress Lu who ruled China so severely from 195 to 180 B.C. Lu, hard and inflexible, killed and poisoned her rivals and enemies with all the gusto of a Medicean. She chose and deposed kings, and had her husband's favorite concubine shorn of ears and eyes and thrown into a latrine. Though hardly 1 in 10,000 Chinese were literate under the Manchus, education was customary among the women of the upper classes in ancient days. Many of them wrote poetry, and Pan Chao, the gifted sister of the historian Pan Ku, circa 100 A.D., completed his history after his death and won high recognition from the emperor. Probably the establishment of the feudal system in China reduced the political and economic status of woman and brought with it an especially rigorous form of the patriarchal family. Usually all the male descendants and their wives and children lived with the oldest male, and though the family owned its land in common, it acknowledged the complete authority of the patriarch over both the family and its property. By the time of Confucius, the power of the father was almost absolute. He could sell his wife or his children into servitude, though he did so only under great need. And if he wished, he could put his children to death with no other restraint than public opinion. He ate his meals alone, not inviting either his wife or his children to table with him except on rare occasions. When he died, his widow was expected to avoid remarriage. Formerly, she had been required to commit sati in his honor, and cases of this occurred in China to the end of the 19th century. He was courteous to his wife, as to everybody, but he maintained a severe distance, almost a separation of caste, between himself and his wife and children. The women lived in distinct quarters of the home, and seldom mingled with the men. Social life was exclusively male, except for promiscuous women. The man thought of his wife as the mother of his children. He honored her not for her beauty or her culture, but for her fertility, her industry, and her obedience. In a celebrated treatise, the Lady Pan Ho Pan, from the same elevation of aristocracy, wrote with edifying humility of the proper condition of women. We occupy the last place in the human species. We are the weaker part of humanity. The basest functions are and should be our portion. Rightly and justly does the Book of the Laws of the Sexes make use of these words. If a woman has a husband after her own heart, it is for her whole life. If a woman has a husband against her heart, it is also for life. And Fu Shuan sang, How sad it is to be a woman. Nothing on earth is held so cheap. Boys stand leaning at the door like gods fallen out of heaven. Their hearts brave the 4 oceans, the wind and dust of 1,000 miles. No one is glad when a girl is born. By her the family sets no store. When she grows up she hides in her room, afraid to look a man in the face. No one cries when she leaves her home. Sudden as clouds when the rain stops. She bows her head and composes her face. Her teeth are pressed on her red lips. She bows and kneels countless times. Perhaps such quotations do injustice to the Chinese home. There was rank subjection in it, and quarrels were frequent between man and woman, and among the children, but there were also much kindness and affection, much mutual helpfulness, and constant cooperation in the busy functioning of a natural home. Though economically subordinate, the woman enjoyed the franchise of the tongue, and might scold her man into fright or flight in the best Occidental style. The patriarchal family could not be democratic, much less egalitarian, because the state left to the family the task of maintaining social order. The home was at once a nursery, a school, a workshop, and a government. The relaxation of family discipline in America has been made possible only by the economic unimportance of the urban home and the appropriation of family functions by the school, the factory, and the state. The type of character produced by these domestic institutions has won the highest praise of many travelers. Allowing for the many exceptions that weaken every social generalization, the average Chinese was a model of filial obedience and devotion, of wholesome respect and willing care for the old. He accepted patiently the character-forming precepts of the Li Qi, or Book of Ceremonies, carried easily its heavy burden of etiquette, regulated every phase of his life with its rules of passionless courtesy, and acquired under it an ease and excellence of manners, a poise and dignity of bearing unknown to his compeers of the West, so that a coolie carrying dung through the streets might show better breeding and more self-respect than the alien merchant who sold him opium. The Chinese learned the art of compromise and graciously saved the face of his worsted enemy. He was occasionally violent in speech and always loquacious, often unclean and not invariably sober, given to gambling and gluttony, to petty peculation and courteous mendacity. He worshipped the god of wealth with too frank an idolatry, and was as hungry for gold as a caricatured American. He was capable occasionally of cruelty and brutality, and accumulating injustices sometimes provoked him to mass outbreaks of pillage and slaughter. But in nearly all cases he was peaceable and kindly, ready to help his neighbors, disdainful of criminals and warriors, thrifty and industrious, leisurely but steady at his work, simple and unassuming in his mode of life, and comparatively honest in commerce and finance. He was silent and patient under the whip of adversity, and took good and evil fortune alike with a wise humility. He bore bereavement and agony with fatalistic self-control, and showed little sympathy for those who suffered them audibly. He mourned long and loyally for his departed relatives, and when all his compromises had failed to elude it, faced his own death with philosophic calm. He was as sensitive to beauty as he was insensitive to pain. He brightened his cities with colorful decoration, and adorned his life with the maturest art. If we wish to understand this civilization, we must forget for a moment the bitter chaos and helplessness into which it has been thrown by its own internal weakness and by contact with the superior guns and machines of the West. We must see it at any one of its many apogees, under the Zhou princes, or Ming Huang, or Hui Tsung, or Kang Shi. For in those quiet and beauty-loving days the Chinese represented without doubt the highest civilization and the ripest culture that Asia, or perhaps any continent, had yet achieved. 6. A government praised by Voltaire. The submergence of the individual, self-government, the village and the province, the laxity of the law, the severity of punishment, the emperor, the censor, administrative boards, education for public office, nomination by education, the examination system, its defects, its virtues. The most impressive aspect of this civilization was its system of government. If the ideal state is a combination of democracy and aristocracy, the Chinese have had it for more than 1,000 years. If the best government is that which governs least, then the Chinese have had the best. Never has a government governed so many people, or governed them so little, or so long. Not that individualism or individual liberty flourished in China. On the contrary, the concept of the individual was weak, and lost him in the groups to which he belonged. He was, first of all, a member of a family, and a passing unit in a stream of life between his ancestors and his posterity. By law and custom, he was responsible for the acts of the others of his household, and they were responsible for his. Usually he belonged to some secret society, and, in the town, to a guild. These limited his rights to do as he pleased. A web of ancient custom bound him, and a powerful public opinion threatened him with ostracism if he seriously violated the morals or traditions of the group. It was precisely the strength of these popular organizations, rising naturally out of the needs and voluntary cooperation of the people, that made it possible for China to maintain itself in order and stability despite the weakness of law and the state. But within the framework of these spontaneous institutions of self-government, the Chinese remained politically and economically free. The great distances that separated one city from another, and all of them from the imperial capital, the dividing effect of mountains, deserts, and unbridged or unnavigable streams, the lack of transport and quick communication, and the difficulty of supporting an army large enough to enforce some central will upon 400 million people, compelled the state to leave to each district an almost complete autonomy. The unit of local administration was the village, loosely ruled by the family heads under the eye of a headman named by the government. A group of villages gathered about a town constituted a hien, or county, of which there were some 1,300 in China. 2 or more hien, ruled together from a city, constituted a fu. 2 or more fu formed a Tao, or circuit. 2 or more Tao made a sheng, or province, and 18 provinces under the Manchus made the empire. The state appointed a magistrate to act as administrator, tax collector, and judge in each hien, a chief officer for each fu and each Tao, and a judge, treasurer, a governor, and sometimes a viceroy for each province. But these officials normally contented themselves with collecting taxes and squeezes, judging such cases as voluntary arbitration had failed to settle, and for the rest leaving the maintenance of order to custom, the family, the clan, and the guild. Each province was a semi-independent state, free from imperial interference or central legislation so long as it paid its tax allotment and kept the peace. Lack of facilities for communication made the central government more an idea than a reality. The patriotic emotions of the people were spent upon their districts and provinces, and seldom extended to the empire as a whole. In this loose structure, law was weak, unpopular, and diverse. The people preferred to be ruled by custom, and to settle their disputes by face-saving compromises out of court. They expressed their view of litigation by such pithy proverbs as sue a flea and catch a bite, or win your lawsuit, lose your money. In many towns of several thousand population, years passed without a case coming into the courts. The laws had been codified under the Tang emperors, but they dealt almost entirely with crime and attempted no formulation of a civil code. Trials were simple, for no lawyer was allowed to argue a case in court, though licensed notaries might occasionally prepare and read to the magistrate a statement in behalf of a client. There were no juries, and there was scant protection in the law against the sudden seizure and secret retention of a person by the officers of the state. Suspects were fingerprinted, and confessions were sometimes elicited by tortures slightly more physical than those now used for such purposes in the most enlightened cities. Punishment was severe, but hardly as barbarous as in most other countries of Asia. It began with cutting off the hair, and went on to flogging, banishment, or death. If the criminal had exceptional merits or rank, he might be allowed to kill himself. There were generous commutations of sentences, and capital punishment could in normal times be imposed only by the emperor. Theoretically, as with us, all persons were equal before the law. These laws never availed to prevent brigandage on the highways or corruption in office and the courts, but they cooperated modestly with custom and the family to give China a degree of social order and personal security not equaled by any other nation before our century. Poised precariously above these teeming millions sat the emperor. In theory, he ruled by divine right. He was the son of heaven and represented the supreme being on earth. Hence his realm was sometimes called Tian-Chan, the heaven-ruled. Europeans translated this into the celestial kingdom and spoke of the Chinese learnedly as celestials. By virtue of his godlike powers, he ruled the seasons and commanded men to coordinate their lives with the divine order of the universe. His decrees were laws, and his judgments were the final court. He administered the state and was head of its religion. He appointed all officials, examined the highest contestants for office, and chose his successor to the throne. Actually, his powers were wholesomely limited by custom and law. He was expected to rule without contravening the regulations that had come down from the sacred past. He might at any moment be rebuked by a strange dignitary known as the censor. He was in effect imprisoned by a ring of counselors and commissioners whose advice it was usually expedient for him to accept. And if he ruled very unjustly or unwell, he lost, by common custom and consent, the mandate of heaven, and might be violently deposed without offense to religion or morality. The censor was head of a board whose function it was to inspect all officials in the administration of their duties, and the emperor was not exempt from this supervision. Several times in the course of history, the censor has reproved the emperor himself. For example, the censor Sung respectfully suggested to the emperor Jia Qing, 1796 to 1821 A.D., a moderation in his attachment to actors and strong drink. Jia Qing summoned Sung to his presence and angrily asked him what punishment was proper for so insolent an official. Sung answered, "Death by the slicing process." Ordered to select a milder penalty, he answered, "Let me be beheaded." Ordered to select a milder penalty, he recommended that he be strangled. The emperor, impressed by his courage and disturbed by his propinquity, made him governor of the province of Ili. The imperial government had come to be a highly complex administrative machine. Nearest to the throne was the Grand Council, composed of 4 great ministers, usually headed by a prince of the royal blood. By custom it met daily, in the early hours of the morning, to determine the policies of the state. Superior in rank but inferior in influence was another group of advisers called the Inner Cabinet. The work of administration was headed by 6 boards: of civil office, of revenue, of ceremonies, of war, of punishments, and of works. There was a colonial office for managing such distant territories as Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, but there was no foreign office. China recognized no other nations as its equals and made no provisions for dealing with them beyond arrangements for the reception of tribute-bearing embassies. The weakness of the government lay in its limited revenues, its inadequate defenses, and its rejection of any instructive intercourse with the outside world. It taxed the land, monopolized the sale of salt, and impeded the development of commerce by levying, after 1852, a duty on the transit of goods along the main routes of the country. But the poverty of the people, the difficulty of collection, and the dishonesty of the collectors kept the national revenue at too low a point to finance the naval and military forces that might have saved China from invasion and shameful defeat. Perhaps the basic defect was in the personnel of the government. The ability and honesty of its officials deteriorated throughout the 19th century and left the nation essentially leaderless when half the wealth and power of the world were joining in an assault upon its independence, its resources, and its institutions. Nevertheless, those officials had been chosen by the most unique and all in all the most admirable method ever developed for the selection of public servants. It was a method that would have interested Plato, and despite its failure and abandonment today, it still endears China to the philosopher. Theoretically, the plan provided a perfect reconciliation of aristocracy and democracy. All men were to have an equal opportunity to make themselves fit for office, but office was to be open only to those who had made themselves fit. Practically, the method produced good results for 1,000 years. It began in the village schools, simple private institutions, often no more than a room in a cottage, where an individual teacher, out of his own meager remuneration, provided an elementary education for the sons of the prosperous. The poorer half of the population remained illiterate. These schools were not financed by the state, nor were they conducted by the clergy. Education, like marriage, remained in China independent of religion, except insofar as Confucianism was its creed. Hours were long and discipline was severe in these modest schoolhouses. The children reported to the teacher at sunrise, studied with him till 10, had breakfast, resumed their studies till 5, and then were free for the day. Vacations were few and brief. There were no lessons after noon in the summer, but to atone for this leisure to work in the fields, there were school sessions in the winter evenings. The chief instruments of instruction were the writings of Confucius, the poetry of the Tang, and a whip of clinging bamboo. The method was memory. Day after day the young students learned by heart and discussed with their teacher the philosophy of Kung the Master, until almost every word of it had sunk into their memories, and some of it into their hearts. China hoped that in this joyless and merciless way even a peasant lad might be turned into a philosopher and a gentleman. The graduate emerged with little information and much understanding, factually ignorant and mentally mature. From these local schools the children might go on to one of the rare and poorly equipped colleges of the empire. More frequently they studied with a tutor or with a few precious books at home. Needy students were often financed through such schooling by men of means, on the understanding that they would return the loan with interest on their appointment to office and their access to squeeze. It was on the basis of this education that China established, first tentatively under the Han, then definitely under the Tang dynasties, its system of examinations for public office. It is an evil for the people, said China, that its rulers should learn to rule by ruling. As far as possible, they should learn to rule before ruling. It is an evil for the people that they should have no access to office, that government should be the privilege of an hereditary few. But it is good for the people that office should be confined to those who have been prepared for it by ability and training. To offer all men democratically an equal opportunity for such training, and to restrict office aristocratically to those who proved themselves best, was the solution that China proposed for the ancient and insoluble problem of government. This book is continued on Cassette 10, Side 1.